this is a topic about which I've been thinking for quite some time in the context of the habilitation thesis I'm currently writing about tradition in historical method in antiquity. Of course, Herodotus source citations are a very relevant, also very delicate problem there. And it is well, great to have the opportunity to present my thoughts here to so many Herodotian experts and get their feedback. So thank you very much for that. And also thanks to all who are here to listen to this. One part of my habilitation thesis about tradition in the historical method in antiquity deals with the rather haphazard source citation phenomenon, or what seems to be a phenomenon of rather haphazard source citations in ancient historiography. So the general observation is, of course, well known. I've just listed two examples here. It's also been made in the context of Herodotus, for instance, by Asheri in the introduction to his commentary. It is in this context, of course, that we need to wonder what are Herodotus source citations, especially, of course, in the context of the polemical contribution by Fehling, who famously claimed that Herodotus just made up his source citations, and about which Fowler, I think there could be many other examples, but Fowler, of course, I think has rightly pointed out that there does appear, even if, as most people nowadays would not accept Fehling's view completely, but there does appear to have been considerable manipulation of the facts between their discovery and their presentation, Fowler notes. And he also points out that a middle way must be found between Fehling's extreme position and the pleasant but equally indefensible picture of Herodotus as a researcher faithful to the facts as we understand them. This is perhaps also the point at which I should explain my probably somewhat enigmatic title, which means to indicate that I actually think most of the solution is already there, but in two articles that are not often enough, I think, cited in that context, and that also need to be put together in a way that, as far as I know, has not quite been done yet. And then maybe a little or one more aspect needs to be added to arrive at a solution that is new in the sense that the existing ideas have never been put together in quite this way, as far as I know. Of course, there are many others on whose work I'm building as well, work on Herodotus by Diels, Jacobi, Fehling, Marincola, the Wild West, and many, many others. And as we will see at the end, also one article that is not about Herodotus that has given me the inspiration for the final step of my argument. Why are Schepens and Lurgahi, or their papers, my main building blocks? This is because I think the problem mainly consists of two interrelated questions that I shall be discussing for the largest part of this paper. Namely, on the one hand, what qualifies as a source citation in ancient Greek historiography, and this is where Schepens' article comes in. And secondly, how should we classify Herodotus citations of individuals and groups who provide information, and what purpose do such citations serve? That's the question I will mostly address by building on Lurgahi's article, but also, as I said, with some inspiration from Coulet. Of course, as I said, I mean, these papers are well known, but even so, just cite one example here, Marincola, who notes that Lurgahi is a promising start to faced the challenge that failing has set, but much more needs to be said and many issues remain, which is interesting because it made me think a lot more about the problem, because actually when I first read Lurgahi, I thought, well, then it's solved. But indeed, then thinking about it more on the basis of this statement by Marinkola, I realized that it's not quite solved, although Lurgahi does indeed, as I said, offer an important contribution. And the fact also, I think that these papers are not used as often as maybe they could in Herodotean scholarship is also clear from this recent volume on Herodotus source citations, edited by Dunsch and Roofing, in which the introduction, which offers a brief overview of the scholarship, cites neither article and no contribution in the volume cites Schepens' paper, whereas even Lurgahi is only cited in 4 contributions, and in one of those actually, the one by Nesselrath, Lurgahi's views are rejected, although as we will later see, I don't quite get why, because I actually think that Nesselrath and Lurgahi argue completely complementary views that actually reinforce each other. In any case, then there are some questions to be asked. As I said, first of all, what qualifies as a source citation in ancient Greek historiography? And this is where I will mostly build on Schepens, but first I will present some definitions of the concept of sources. I start with the one that's probably used most often in Germany by Paul Kirn. Sources is what we call all texts, objects, or facts from which one can obtain knowledge about the past. This definition is very widely used, as I said, because some people seem to think that it's perfect. Actually, I think there are many reasons why it is not quite perfect, but these are only tangentially relevant to what I'm doing here, so I won't go into that right now. The main point is that sources are understood in terms of physical remains from the past in some form. The same, for instance, in this brief sort of definition from the Cambridge History faculty on their website, any leftover of the past can be considered a source. This approach, of course, goes back a long time, and indeed Langlois and Seigneur-Bosse, in their famous introduction to the study of history from the late 19th century, likewise pointed out that so every thought and every action that has left no visible traces, or none but what have since disappeared, is lost for history. No documents, no history. So again, there's this clear focus on the physical objects from which we can obtain our information about the past. And this is central to the argument that Schepens develops in his paper about the difference between ancient Greek and modern source theory. So the modern theory, as we've also just seen, starts from the objectively existing external carriers of information. I use this somewhat convoluted phrase so that we can also include eyewitnesses, who are of course not objects, but they're also not texts or facts, which are of course relevant not only to modern oral history, but also very relevant to the problem of Herodotus source citations. So Schepens labels this with the German word Erkenntnisstoff and opposes this to the ancient Greek approach in which the subjective cognitive faculties of the historian, which he labels in German Erkenntniskräfte, are understood to be the historian's sources. So as opposed to the modern objective approach where we have literary texts, coins, inscriptions, eyewitnesses, etc. This means for the ancient Greek historian, there was opsis, sight, gnome, judgment, historiae, inquiry, and akoe, hearing. This Schepens illustrates with a very famous passage from Herodotus, Book 2, which is translated by Godley as, "So far, all I have said is the record of my own autopsy and judgment and inquiry." So gnome, historiae, and opsis. But as Schepens pointed out, the words record in Godley's translation do not appear in the original Greek, and neither do many of the other ways in which most modern translators have tried to resolve this somewhat puzzling phrasing of Herodotus. But it is important, as Schepens show, not to try and resolve what seems to us to be a very puzzling phrasing, but rather to leave it as it is, because it shows very clearly that this is a specific ancient Greek way of thinking about the source problem, namely the cite, the judgment, and the inquiry are the historian's sources. This is also very clear in Schepens' second example from a speech in Thucydides, where the speaker asks, "Now, what need is there to speak about matters quite remote, whose only witnesses are the stories men hear, rather than the eyes of those who will hear them told? But concerning the Persian War and all the other events of which you have personal knowledge, we needs must speak, even though it will be rather irksome to mention them, since they are always being paraded." So here is made an interesting difference between more recent and more remote past. But the central point is that for the history of the remote past, the sources, and again here we should slightly revise the Lub translation, the sources are the hearings of stories rather than the sight of those who will hear them told. So again, this sounds very counterintuitive for us, because we would, of course, think that the speaker, the person who tells the story, is the source, or the author who has written it down is the source. But to the ancient Greeks, it is the act of hearing the story that constitutes the source. And a final example that Schepens also offers, well, he offers many more, but I'm offering this one as a final example, is from Polybius' criticism of Timaeus, where Polybius writes that nature has given us two instruments, as it were, by the aid of which we inform ourselves and inquire about everything. These are hearing and sight, and of the two, sight is much more veracious, according to Heraclitus. The eyes are more accurate witnesses than the ears, he says. Now Timaeus enters on his inquiries by the pleasanter of the two roads, but the inferior one, for he entirely avoids employing his eyes and prefers to employ his ears. So here, I think there's two interesting points, namely on the one hand that the cognitive faculties or the organs that we have that help us to exercise the cognitive faculties of seeing and hearing, namely our eyes and our ears, are the witnesses rather than the person who uses their eyes or ears. And again, that these are the roads, the hodoi, by which one can obtain information as a historian. It is important to get these distinctions exactly right, which is why I offer one example here of a scholar who does use Schepens' theory, but I think in a very instructive way does not quite summarize it correctly. So de Kloven, she writes, in other words, if I've understood Schepens' arguments correctly, for the ancients, the witness of the near or remote past is not the historical document, as Langlois and Seignobos taught, it is the historian themselves. Hence the importance attached to the assessment and to the legitimation of their authority. So on the modern side, of course, where the document, in the sense of the objective physical source, is correct, but on the ancient side, it is not the historian who is the witness, but it is the cognitive faculties of the historian. As again, we can see very clearly in the Polybius passage. So in order to hopefully illustrate this a little more clearly, it is not the objective source, as in our modern source theory, or even the historian themselves who is questioning the eyewitness here, or even, as one might also think, the information contained in the source, but it is the cognitive faculties of the historians, which I've tried to illustrate with these waves here. So the activity of sight, or this historian who is using her judgment in interpreting the text, or this one indeed who is using his hearing to question an eyewitness. So there's some sort of dimension of thin air here, maybe, which makes it all seem quite esoteric, but it's highly relevant to understand that this is the way the ancients approached the question of sources. And it makes more sense than we might think at first sight, because of course it tallies very well, for instance, with this famous remark from Bloch about sources and their value, where he says, for even those texts or archaeological documents which seem the clearest and the most accommodating will speak only when they are properly questioned. Before Boucher de Perthes, as in our own day, there were plenty of flint artifacts in the alluvium of the Somme. However, there was no one to ask questions, and therefore there was no prehistory. So he's trying to express here that only once these particular kind of stones found in the Somme are starting to be collected by someone who will ask questions about why they all look the same, and about how they originated, which in Boucher de Perthes' view was not natural, as opposed to what most other people thought, that actually these objects could turn into sources for prehistory, and indeed for forming the basis for the concept of the Stone Age. It is also, as Schepens himself already pointed out, why in historical method in antiquity, the historian's life and character are such central elements. This, again, is something that can be developed even further on the basis of recent developments since the 1980s in the field of epistemology, with so-called virtue epistemology, which tries to place this subjective side of creating knowledge on a sort of, or systematically analyze it and ask which role it plays in constructing knowledge. I've explored this elsewhere for ancient historiography, and I can also warmly recommend a forthcoming book by Hermann Paul about historians' virtues from antiquity to the 21st century, where this is explored in even more detail. So this subjective approach might, for many reasons, make much sense. And in any case, it is important as well if we're going to ask what is a source reference. So we need a definition here as well. And I would define a source reference as an indication of the direct provenance of the information the historian is presenting. This means that a reference can be classified as a source reference only if it gives the answer to the question how the historian directly obtained their knowledge. This means that to the question, how did Herodotus obtain his knowledge, a modern and an ancient answer, which are different, will of course be given. So in terms of modern source theory, one would answer from eyewitnesses, inscriptions, archaeological objects, geographical facts, whereas the ancient answer would rather be through sight, hearing, inquiry, and judgment. And that, of course, also affects what we identify as source references. For instance, in this instance from chapter 15 in book 2, as the Egyptians themselves say, and as it seems to me, in the end, the modern source reference would be the Egyptians themselves as local eyewitnesses, whereas on the ancient view, it would rather be Herodotus' practice or use of his gnome, his judgment in terms of how it seems to him. And again, in book 2, in chapter 113, where he says, the priests told me upon my inquiry, for our modern source theory, the priests, as again, eyewitnesses, would be the source, but in the ancient theory, it's rather Herodotus' activity of exercising inquiry. And the final example here, because there's a double instance of each in chapter 12 in book 3, having heard about it from the people of the country, I saw a strange thing on the site of the battle, the bones of those killed on either side in this fight lying scattered separately. So the modern theory would of course say the source reference are the references to the people of the country and to the archaeological objects of the bones that are still lying around on the battlefield. But for the ancient theory, it would be having heard and I saw that constitutes the source reference. On this basis, I would present as my preliminary conclusion, first of all, references to sight, hearing, inquiry, and judgment are source references. Citations of persons or groups who make statements must be something other than source references. And this, of course, leads us to my second question. How should we classify Herodotus' citations of individuals and groups who make statements, and what purpose do such citations serve? This, as I said, is where I'll be building mostly on Lurgahi, but it is important, I think, to take one step back, which is also how Lurgahi himself starts his article, namely by pointing out that scholars long before Fehling, of course, were troubled by some aspects of Herodotus' source references. And an important feature there is the problem of indirect citations. So it has been noticed in several cases that Herodotus cites local informants that already, however, seem to have been mentioned in previous Greek texts, especially Hecataeus of Miletus. And so Jacobi notes that in such cases, when Herodotus does give a citation, he does not refer to the Greek writer who had seen and recorded these matters before him, but to the original sources, i.e. the statements of the epichorioi, regardless of whether they were already mentioned by the predecessor or consulted by Herodotus himself to check the latter's account. The Greek mediator, considered irrelevant, remains unmentioned. This, of course, well, the word sources would not be used in this way if we follow Schepens, but that point is not relevant here in this context. But the observation that apparently not all of these citations of local informants seem to be direct citations. And what is, of course, had been noticed already by Diels in the 19th century. It is also argued in some instances by Nesselrath in the paper I mentioned earlier. And of course, it ties in very well with what we generally know now about the amount of written information available to Herodotus. For instance, thanks to Fowler's paper that I already mentioned, but also to Jan's dissertation and his article on inscriptions in Herodotus, in which he shows just how much written material is in the background of Herodotus' inquiry and writing his work. So partially on this basis, Lurgahi develops 4 main points that are, in his view, to explain better than in Jacobi's attempt that they are sort of indirect source citations, that if the citations are to reflect the way in which and the places where Herodotus actually collected his information, I quote, "we could not avoid Fehling's conclusion. They are absolutely too good to be true." Lurgahi therefore argues that the reference to the act of speaking in such statements as the Persians say should not be taken literally. It rather means the Persians believe. And with these citations, Lurgahi argues, Herodotus, I quote, is simply referring to what he holds to be the social and or ethnic dimension of the knowledge he is drawing from, end of quote. So this means these references indicate whose tradition is being reported in a way typical of an oral culture. And finally, the citations can thus not be understood as indicating the immediate provenance of the information Herodotus collected. They are not source references and should rather be called akoe statements. As I've pointed out in the beginning already, some questions might remain on this basis because one might then ask, well, what's the purpose of these akoe statements? And one possible answer there is what Schepens and Gillis have argued on the basis of their statistical analysis of all the source references, namely that they are disclaimers. So they conclude, I quote, "there appears to be a correlation between the citation of a source with expressed doubt or a desire of Herodotus to distance himself from the information, and on the other hand, in the case of certain very specific items of information, between the absence of a source and Herodotus' willingness to identify with the information." Jacobi had already pointed out that this cannot be the whole story because the same view had been put forward in the 19th century already by Meeus, but Jacobi in this context rightly points out that often Herodotus cites two witnesses who are in agreement, and there it is clear that he wants to authenticate a fact by means of the agreement of the witnesses. And he goes on to say that even where there are only single citations, it is immediately obvious that the reference to the source is intended either to authenticate the information or to show that it is doubtful. In this sense, well, we would of course like to be able to decide between validators or disclaimers, but I think, as Tom Harrison has rightly said, there are no simple rules. But while we are on the topic of rules, I do think it makes sense to look a little more at Fehling's rules, or two of Fehling's rules, namely the one that Herodotus always cites the obvious source, and also that he always retains party bias. Now, the first one was basically already observed by Jacobi, who noted that it is clear that those who are cited are always those who should, for some reason or other, have exact knowledge of the fact. On this basis, one could ask whether, for instance, the ones who should know, who are the ones who are like the obvious source because it's their own history, occur more often as a validator, and on the other rule of party bias, whether those who should know but might also have a vested interest are more often present as a disclaimer. In any case, I think Lurgahi has pointed out very well in this respect that Fehling's rules work much better under the presupposition that Herodotus was not using source references to deceive his readers. Indeed, I think they are there both to show Herodotus' critical attitude towards his material, but also to help the readers. And so on that basis, I would suggest that the answer to our question, what are these citations, and if they're not source citations, if they're not generally just disclaimers or validators, I would suggest that they are authorities to whom in the end Herodotus sort of gives responsibility for the information. And this, I said, I got the inspiration for this point from a paper by Goulet who asks this question for Diogenes Laertius, when he says, is it the intention of the author to indicate the immediate sources that have been used, or rather merely the authorities who guarantee the trustworthiness of the statements made? And so this paper was, the existence of this paper was pointed out to me a long time ago by Stefan Schorn in a very different context, but I was suddenly reminded of its potential relevance when looking at Herodotus source references. And I think indeed a good case can be made for the view that these citations are citations of the authorities responsible for a particular view. So in connection to Vehling's first rule, they are the ones who are supposed to know their own polis or sometimes family history. In several instances, they are qualified as logios, as learned, as wise. Also, in many cases, they have a high social status. For instance, the Egyptian priests, or Tersandros of Orchomenus, of whom Herodotus himself says that he was one of the leading men in his polis, or also, interestingly, in a case where Herodotus very clearly not believes the information, he notes that his witness is of, at least in a Greek's view, lower social status, temple scribe, rather than the priests of a temple of Athena in Egypt. And also in some cases, they are of excellent character. They are kaloi kagatoi. And so here as well, I think this works if we look at questions of consensus or disagreement of authorities, as for instance in this the episode about the conflict between Athens and Aegina, where Herodotus indicates that this then is the story told by the Argives and the Aeginetans, and the Athenians too acknowledge that only one man of their number returned safely to Attica. So here we have both parties giving their view and agreeing up to this point. So here, of course, Herodotus would probably think, and his readers might agree, that the combined authority of the opposing parties is quite strong. But then he wants us to know that for the rest of the story, how exactly it came to be that only one man survived. The Argives and the Athenians have different views, and in the end they are both involved parties, so it is hard to judge in and of itself whose authority here is stronger, and Herodotus probably just wants to leave the question open. Likewise, in the case of the Parian expedition, where Herodotus notes all the Greeks tell the same story up to this point. After this, the Parians themselves say that the following happened. So again, I think here Herodotus tries to show that the authority for the first part of the story is stronger. It's all Greeks, so probably very few Greeks would have or see any reason there to doubt the authority, but the other part might be more questionable. And there it's a question of how seriously or how one wants to judge the authority of the Parians in this particular instance. Sometimes Herodotus will make it more clear, perhaps, what he wants with the combined authorities, or even more clear, as in the famous case of the question of the Greekness of the Macedonian kings, where, of course, the fact that the Macedonian kings themselves say it is fairly weak authority because they have a vested interest in the claim, but Herodotus adds not only his own authority, that he knows it himself and will prove it later, but also the authority of the Hellanodikai. And of course, one could go two ways with this. So I know David Fern has argued that actually for Herodotus, the Hellanodikai are quite unreliable, but I actually think that Herodotus, in as far as even this could only be noticed by those who would have known both Book 2 and Book 5, and had all of it clearly in their memory. Of course, the fact that Herodotus claims that the Egyptians saw room for improvement in the fairness of the Olympic Games, whereas the Eleans did not, does not necessarily mean that Herodotus thinks the Hellanodikai are generally unreliable. I would say he rather cites them here in this case, which does not involve the question about judging about Elean participants, or even if some of the other participants were Eleans. It only shows all the more that the Hellanodikai judged fairly in that they ruled in favor of the Macedonian king. And so here I think Herodotus, as an even stronger third authority, adds the Hellanodikai, who are of course leading men in their own polis. But in the end, I think the key is in the fact that Herodotus himself has no obligation to believe. So the very famous statement in Book 7, as for myself, although it is my business to set down that which is told me, to believe it is none at all of my business. This I ask the reader to hold true for the whole of my history. And I think in that sense, Herodotus cites whenever he knows who is the authority for a particular story, or knows it and thinks it's relevant, he will also indicate it, both to indicate that it's not necessarily himself vouching for the validity of the information, but also to help the reader in assessing the criteria that would be relevant here. In that sense, I would not agree with this statement by West, who claims that Herodotus seems to have been strangely sheltered from the frustrations and uncertainties to which we would expect him to have been exposed if he had accumulated his material, as he would have us believe, from local traditions supplemented by his own observation in the course of wide-ranging journeys. So even if not all of these are actual source citations for Herodotus, so claims for the direct provenance of the information, I think the very opposite is the case, as De Wald, for instance, has noted. The persona that emerges from such a survey has gone to the trouble of collecting, testing, and recording logoi, but he does not want us, his readers, to forget the difficulties of his task. And also, I think he does not want the readers to be deprived from the access he has to the knowledge about who is the authority responsible for a particular piece of information. As a final observation, I would like to add something about the usefulness of the different labels, though. Lurgahi, in his article citing Erbse, who claimed that the expression source reference, misleading because ambiguous, should be avoided in Herodotean studies. But I think Lurgahi himself rightly pointed out that these citations of local informants are not source references because they are not the indications of the actual immediate provenance of Herodotus' information, or at least they need not be. But I do think that properly defined, the different labels can be useful indeed for distinguishing between a source reference on ancient terms or a source reference on modern terms, or indeed the indication of an authority. So my conclusion would be that citations of persons or groups who make statements, who offer information, are not source references because they do not, or at least not in every case, indicate the direct origin of Herodotus' knowledge. Whenever they do, they might be source references on modern terms, but they need not be, and I think we need not worry about it, because they are only there to identify the authority responsible for the correctness of the claim in question, regardless of the way the information was obtained, regardless of whether Herodotus himself spoke to these people or whether he found their claims in some other written source. There is no need, as I said, to avoid the expression source reference if it is properly defined and applied accordingly, as it was, for instance, done very well, I think, in Nicky Rawnsley's paper in the Herodotus Helpline. It is a helpful category to label Herodotus source references on his own terms. Finally, indicating as they do how Herodotus obtained his information, references to sight, hearing, inquiry, and judgment are rightly to be called source references. Thank you.